Now, if you were trying to follow along in the Magnificat, we use special readings today for the feast of St. Maximilian Kolbe. Maximilian is one of the saints of the 20th century. Born in Poland, even before Poland existed. Remember, before World War I, it was divided between Prussia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia. He was born there, and when he was a young boy, he had a vision, a dream, it's a little unclear, in which Mary offered him two crowns, a red crown and a white crown, and said, "Which one do you want?" Now, white stands for purity, red for martyrdom. And being a little kid, what would he say? "I want both." And it was granted. Very religious parents. He became one of our friars, went down to Rome to study. And in those days, this is around the end of World War I, things were not good in Rome. Rome had been reunified in 1870, and there was a huge influence of the Freemasons. In fact, they would have huge, loud demonstrations in front of churches. And one of our friars was standing on the banks of the Tiber River watching the construction of one of the bridges, and he was killed by Freemasons, stabbing him in the back. So it was a time of confusion. Communism was starting to be born in these countries. And Maximilian and some of his classmates decided the way that we'll fight this is by dedicating ourselves to Mary Immaculate. And he found what was called the Militia of Mary Immaculate, 1919. When he finished his studies, he got a doctorate in Rome, went back to Poland, and at first it wasn't going well. He developed tuberculosis. So he was treated for that for a while. And then in 27, he decided to form a new community of friars dedicated to Our Lady. It's in a place called Niepoklanów. Now, if you're not Polish, that's a real tough word. I'm Polish background, so even if you have 5 consonants without a vowel, no problem. But most non-Poles need to buy a vowel or two. He established that friary to divulge devotion to Mary in many forms. And when I say many forms, they had a daily newspaper, over 100,000 copies a day, but on the weekend, 230,000 copies. A monthly magazine, by the time it closed down, over 1 million copies a month. Radio program. He was experimenting with TV. He was debating with his friars whether or not to build an airport at the friary. There were somewhere between 600 and 800 friars. So an incredible energy, and this is a man who had tuberculosis, who wasn't in the best of health. Then he decides, I'm going to be a missionary. So he set out, he tried out India, China, wasn't working, ended up in Japan. And he built his friary at Nagasaki. Now, you remember Nagasaki. Because he was a Catholic, he had to build it in the worst part of town, which just happened to be the other side of the mountain. So when the city was bombed, our friary was saved, and it served as a refugee center. Went back to Poland around 36, I believe. And then when the Nazis invaded Poland, he was one of the first arrested. And first the Nazis tried to bargain with him. You see, his last name, Kolbe, is not a Polish name. It's actually a German name. So they wanted him to sign a document saying that he'll identify himself as German. And he says, absolutely not. And he was part of the intelligentsia. When the Nazis invaded, they didn't just go after some people. They wanted to wipe out anyone who was highly educated. So, for example, there was a university called the Jagiellonium. They took out the entire faculty and shot them. They wanted the Poles to be peasants. And since Maximilian Kolbe was a famous figure, he was first arrested, released, but then rearrested. He was sent to Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, even though he had tuberculosis, he survived many months, and then a prisoner escaped. And the rule was if a prisoner escaped, 10 people had to die in a starvation bunker. to prevent prisoners from allowing others to escape. Kolbe was not chosen, but one of the ones chosen yelled out, "I'll never see my wife and children again." So Kolbe walked up to the commandant. You never do that in Auschwitz. He walked up and says, "Take me instead." And he says, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm a Catholic priest." So he was put in the starvation bunker. And normally in this starvation bunker, it was like the bottom side of a staircase, a very small room. Normally people would scream and moan and cry. From his bunker came hymns of praise, hymns of trust. And he was one of the last people to die in that bunker. And in fact, they had to kill him because he wasn't dying. There was a new group of prisoners that were going to be sent there. So they injected him with carbolic acid to kill him. Some of the things I've told you are reasons why he became a patron saint for many different things. For example, volunteers. For example, political prisoners, regular prisoners, intravenous drug users. That's how he died. And Kolbe, he had a beautiful theology that especially dealt with the Blessed Virgin Mary as the Immaculate Conception. Now, just a reminder, Immaculate Conception is not what happens when the Annunciation occurs. Remember, that's something different. The Immaculate Conception refers to the fact that Mary, from the moment of her conception, was protected from sin. Why did that have to happen? I'll give you a simple reason. You're walking outside today in the parking lot, and someone shows up in front of you and says, "Do you want to be the mother of the Son of God?" Now, those of us who are men would sort of wonder how that's going to happen, but I think the women too, what would be the logical reaction? Pepper spray. And what's the second probable reaction? What's in it for me? I'll do it if I get 1/3 of the proceeds from the vigil lights, 2 holy days of obligation, and a couple of good basilicas built in my honor. Mary did not think of herself. She gave of herself totally to the will of God. You can't do that if you're damaged by sin, or else you can do it, but it's much more difficult. Mary was able to surrender totally. And Kolbe, as a faithful disciple, wanted to follow that example. One of my favorite stories about Kolbe is that when they were being taken out of Nipokalanov to go to Auschwitz, they realized that the Nazis would destroy that complex that they had built up, that had taken so long and so much effort. And one of the friars said something negative to him, and he said, "Mary caused it to be built. I'm placing it back in Mary's hands." He didn't hold on to it. It wasn't his. It was Mary's. And that total surrender, realizing that we're not in charge. God is. And we have to trust. The other beautiful thing is found on the shrine of St. Maximilian Kolbe. Before you drive out today, maybe you'll think of visiting that. He was asked by one of his fellow prisoners in Auschwitz, "Shouldn't we hate the Nazis?" And his answer, "Only love creates." When people hate us or preach hate, we have to respond with love, because that's the only way we will defeat hate in this world. St. Augustine was asked, does evil exist? And he says, no, it doesn't exist. Now, either he never watched the evening news, or he was a philosopher, and it was the latter. He said, evil is not something that exists. It's an absence of good, an absence of love. Dark is an absence of light. How do you resolve darkness? Turn on the light. Cold is an absence of heat. How do you resolve cold? Get a heater. Hatred and evil are an absence of love. How do we destroy evil? we love.